Alright, the wait is over. The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power has officially begun, with episodes 1 and 2 being released together for the premiere. So without further ado, here are my thoughts and impressions on them. The beginning was strikingly reminiscent of Peter Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring, with Galadriel once again narrating a prologue that tells us the grand backstory to the events that are about to unfold. In this case, the backstory consisted of a very brief summary of the First Age, which I really enjoyed, especially moments like the two trees of Valinor and their destruction, or the early glimpse of Sauron, which was an awesome surprise that I was not expecting at all. It looked absolutely sick, and it made me even more hyped for his character than I already said I was in my previous video about him. Now, I've seen other fans of the books express a little disappointment about how much they skipped when recounting the events of the First Age, and while I also would have loved to have seen more scenes from the Silmarillion brought to life here, I can totally understand why they didn't show more than they did, because they were clearly focusing on the things that would be especially relevant to this story, like the death of Galadriel's brother Finrod, which, from a storytelling point of view, makes perfect sense. Speaking of Galadriel, what they're doing with her in Rings of Power also reminds me of the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy in a way. Specifically, it reminds me of what Peter Jackson and company did with Aragorn in that adaptation, in that they created a character arc for him that was not in the books. See, in the books, Aragorn is determined from the start to fulfill his destiny as the returning King of Man. But in the movies, he starts out as a reluctant hero who wants nothing to do with his destiny at first, but slowly and gradually comes to accept it over the course of the story. So Aragorn in the movies started out as a very different character from Aragorn in the books, but the intention was always that by the end of the movies, he would become the character we know from the books. Now, how well Peter Jackson succeeded in that will depend on each viewer's interpretation, but what Amazon is doing with Galadriel in Rings of Power seems to me quite similar conceptually. Clearly they also want to give her a character arc where she grows and changes over the course of the show, and so she's starting out very differently than how we know her from the Third Age. In fact, she seems closer to how she was described and portrayed in the First Age, where Tolkien tells us she was, in his words, proud, strong, and self-willed. Likewise, her warrior disposition in Rings of Power might seem jarring to people who've only seen Galadriel in the Lord of the Rings story, where she was more of a serene mage, but again, there is a textual basis for it, as Tolkien also described young Galadriel in the following manner. She was strong of body, mind, and will, a match for both the lore masters and the athletes of the Eldar in the days of their youth. So essentially, what I think the showrunners are doing in Rings of Power is that they're not so much inventing a brand new Galadriel, but rather they're delaying her growth so that the greater part of it happens in the Second Age rather than the First, so that we can actually see in Rings of Power her transition from the proud and self-willed fighter of her younger days to the wise and ethereal Lady of the Woods that we know she ends up becoming. In fact, her actress, Morfydd Clark, has already alluded to that in some interviews, even hinting at how receiving her Ring of Power, Nenya, will be a big shift for Galadriel. So yeah, in theory, this character arc is not a bad idea in my opinion, but of course what matters is the execution and how well they pull it off. Now, based on the first 2 episodes alone, I'm still a bit ambivalent about her portrayal so far. For the most part, I enjoyed her scenes, especially the ones with Elrond, but there are moments where I think they went a little too far, and some of her facial expressions in particular made her seem almost a little unhinged, like she might snap at any moment. So yeah, I thought that was a little too much, and I wish they'd tone it down a little. Hopefully it's just in the beginning, because right now she feels alone and desperate, since no one else seems to acknowledge what she senses to be a very real threat. But as the remaining elves eventually start to recognize that the enemy is indeed still out there, hopefully this side of hers will calm down a little, and she will focus her anger on the enemy and not on her kinsman. Speaking of her kinsman, while I still have that small issue with Galadriel's portrayal, I really liked what we saw of Elrond in these 2 episodes. In fact, it only reaffirmed my belief that he should be the one being treated as the main character of the overall story rather than Galadriel. But he's definitely going to be a very prominent and important character regardless, so that's okay. But yeah, I felt they captured pretty well the qualities that Tolkien emphasized in his first description of Elrond in chapter 3 of The Hobbit. He was as noble and fair as an elf lord, as strong as a warrior, as wise as a wizard, as venerable as a king of dwarves, and as kind as summer. I was particularly pleased to see that Rings of Power stayed true to the as kind as summer part, since while I didn't dislike Hugo Weaving's Elrond in the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy, he definitely didn't come off as particularly kind there. But Robert Aramayo's Elrond absolutely does, and it really showed in his interactions with both Galadriel and Durin. So yeah, I can't wait to see more of his character in the coming episodes. Speaking of Durin and the Dwarves, seeing Khazad-dûm in the heyday of its glory was definitely one of the highlights of these first 2 episodes. It looked every bit as majestic and grandiose as I'd hoped, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more of it and seeing what role the Dwarves will play in this story where they're at the height of their civilization. I still don't like the idea of there being 2 Durins at the same time, since in the books a big part of dwarf culture is centered around the belief that there is only one Durin that reincarnates over and over, but I imagine they'll eventually address that somehow and explain the method to that apparent madness. So we'll see. Now, one species that isn't exactly at the height of their civilization is, of course, the little people known as hobbits, or in this case, Harfoots. I must admit, of all the plotlines we were introduced to in the premiere, this is the one that I'm the least interested in so far. Now, in the interest of fairness, Tolkien did state in the prologue to Lord of the Rings that the beginning of hobbits lies far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. So we know hobbits existed not just in the Second Age, but even in the First Age. But the question isn't whether they existed or not during the time frame of this show. They definitely did. The question is, do they have a story worth telling in this time? I'm afraid the jury is still out on that one. On one hand, the Harfoots did manage to capture some of the charm of the hobbits, but on the other, the whole thing feels a little too derivative so far in my opinion. You know, the leading Harfoot, Nori, is unusually adventurous for a member of a group of people that like to keep out of trouble, just like Bilbo or Frodo, and she even has a somewhat plump sidekick, clearly the Sam to her Frodo, who worries about her and is very concerned about them stepping outside of their little people comfort zone and being exposed to the dangers of the world of the big folk. And as we knew from the trailers already, their storyline seems to be heavily centered on their encounter with this stranger that fell down with the meteor, who appears at the very end of episode 1. The Sauron imagery was pretty strong there, but like I said in my previous video about Sauron, I do feel this is more of a red herring, though I could be wrong. Episode 2 gives us a few more hints, but overall his character and story are still shrouded in mystery. I gotta say though, I hope they don't drag out this mystery for too long, because personally I thought his scenes with the Harfoots in episode 2 weren't exactly riveting and dragged the pacing of the episode down a little. I also hope he's one of the Blue Wizards and not Gandalf like many have been speculating, which, I gotta admit, is definitely looking like a strong possibility after episode 2. If it turns out to be true, that's definitely a very risky move on the showrunner's part, as this whole Harfoot subplot already gives me vibes of a potentially marketing-driven form of fan service that seeks to insert the iconic hobbits in a story that's not about them and where they don't really belong, because that's what everyone expects to see in a Lord of the Rings story. So if they were to, on top of that, add a massive fan favorite like Gandalf into the mix, well, it would only accentuate that impression and make this show feel more like a prequel overly focused on fan service and nods to the original than its own story. Now, I'm not saying that will necessarily be the case. I'm not gonna write off this subplot just 2 episodes in, and I'll certainly be happy to be proven wrong if they can indeed turn this into a compelling story, but so far I'm a bit lukewarm on it. We'll see where they go with this. Of course, the story of the Harfoots isn't the only original story in Rings of Power. The subplot of the Southlands with Arondir, Bronwyn and Theo is also material created for this adaptation, but I'm more into it because I find its premise to be more interesting, partially because it actually has a pretty cool textual basis, as Tolkien did state in the Silmarillion, but a great part of the Sons of Men marched with the enemy, and the Elves do not forget it. That's right, when the first Dark Lord, Morgoth, laid waste to Middle-earth in the First Age, many men from the south and the east allied with him and fought against the Elves, so it makes sense that the Elves would want to keep an eye on them going forward. But of course, this creates a lot of tension because while the elves are immortal and can't easily forget what happened, from the perspective of the humans, the elves are essentially treating them like criminals for the deeds of their ancestors from 1,000 years ago. So it's an interesting dynamic in a situation that naturally lends to a tense and intriguing subplot, which in episode 2 culminated in our first true glimpse of an orc. Now, this scene was suitably creepy, and I was really pleased to see a single orc being portrayed with such menace and horror, as opposed to simply one in a mob of mere cannon fodder, but I didn't really like the way they concluded the scene. The way the orc first appeared was great, and it built some real tension, with Theo and Bronwyn's terror feeling truly palpable, but then, after the mother and son get the upper hand in the skirmish, the scene cuts to Bronwyn emphatically slamming the decapitated head of the orc in the local tavern, with an almost smug look on her face. You know, I just can't help but feel that she overcame her dread a little too quickly. I don't know, I think it would have been more impactful and also more believable if we had seen her actually finish the orc and then seen her like gasping for air and catching her panicked breath, and then, if she really had to present the orc's head to the villagers in order to crush their skepticism, I think it would have been more appropriate if she had done it with a look of anger and urgency rather than smugness. Still, despite this hiccup, I think this subplot has some potential, especially since those sweet maps used in the scene transitions show that this region is seemingly the land that will eventually become Mordor. Okay, so as I'm writing this, I'm noticing that this review might seem a bit on the negative side so far, which kind of goes against the title of the video, but I genuinely feel that these first 2 episodes were a promising start, and if I haven't made that entirely clear with my analysis so far, perhaps it's because the premiere was greater than the sum of its parts, so talking about them individually doesn't really do the overall experience justice. Because overall, I feel they captured the essentials fairly well. The scope feels as epic as it should, there's clearly a meticulous plan for each of the various subplots, the world building is off to a good start, the locales and landscapes were absolutely awe-inspiring and gorgeous to behold, and I was even generally pleased with the dialogue. It felt mostly true to Tolkien's style. Not necessarily the same quality, certainly not always, but I do feel they've at least managed to replicate this style fairly well for the most part. Likewise, more often than not, the cast did a solid job at delivering it in a way that sounded reasonably natural. So yeah, overall, if they play their cards right, I think Rings of Power could turn out to be something special. I don't know if it will reach the heights of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, especially Fellowship of the Ring, which is by far my favorite adaptation of one of Tolkien's works, but it could still turn out to be a very good series. Only time will tell if it will indeed live up to that potential, as we're only 2 episodes in right now, but so far, I think it's off to a solid and promising start. I'm also pretty hyped for episode 3 because, as the end of episode 2 made clear, that's where the story of Númenor will begin, and to me that story is the highlight of this great tale of the Second Age, so I look forward to seeing the splendorous realm of Númenor in all its glory next week. Now, on that note, even though I'd like to, I can't guarantee that I'll be doing weekly reviews for each episode, but I do hope to share some more thoughts and impressions before the season ends, and when it does, I definitely want to make a review of the whole thing where I'll share my final verdict on it, along with my hopes and expectations for season 2 and beyond. So if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, and if you would like to continue to follow my thoughts and impressions on Rings of Power, then it wouldn't hurt to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon. Anyway, that's all for now, so thanks for watching to the end, and as the elves say, ten en omentielva.